Hey friends, welcome to another episode of the Called Collective, where we exist to equip the next generation of ministry leaders. And chances are you've probably asked yourself this question: what am I called to? What am I called to? That's probably one of the greatest questions anyone could ever ask in their life, right? Like, every person on planet Earth wrestles with figuring out their purpose for being here. Calling is this deep-seated, purpose-filled word that just perfectly resonates with the outcry of our hearts to figure out why we're here, what we do, and how we're gifted in all of our skills, and just how all of this stuff can work together. But how does one's calling relate to someone's career? Like, should one's career be his or her calling? Can they be separate? What's the difference between calling, vocation, career, jobs, occupation, and everything else in the mix, right? Even hobbies. Is one calling higher than another, and how in the world do you make it happen? There is so much that is packed in that question of what calling even is. Even as you're probably learning from your own life, figuring out what you're called to do can be incredibly confusing and incredibly difficult. This is even true for my own life. At age 27, I am still trying to figure out what am I called to. It just doesn't get easier the older you get. Further, it doesn't even help that those who are considering a career in ministry often hear this phrase that they are called to ministry, and that has to relate somehow to their career. But if they're called to ministry, do they have to make a career in ministry? There's so much confusion that comes into these different phrases that I think is really important for us to understand how these two meanings of calling and career have come to how we understand them today. Okay, so that's what we're going to address in this video. How can we understand career and calling, and how does that relate to ministry? So let's go several thousand years back, way earlier in human history. People would often have their occupations assigned to them at birth. Yeah, that sounds crazy, right? There's no such thing as choosing your career or going to college to figure out your dream job and all of these other things, because it was expected that you would carry on the family business. So if you were born into a family of shepherds, you would be a shepherd. Or if you were born into a family of fishermen, you would be a fisherman or a carpenter or a sandwich maker, whatever it is. And you might think that sounds absolutely terrible, right? Because you want to have the individual freedom for you to choose what you want to do. So granted, maybe it might be a lot more boring to figure out, to not have to figure out what you want to do on your own. It's a lot simpler. You knew what your job was going to be for the rest of your life. But then you get to the Reformation period in the 1400s, where influential Christians like Martin Luther and John Calvin started emphasizing God's role in every dimension of life, including one's work. Their work was their calling, because God was actively present in their work. In fact, to have a calling from God was the same as having a vocation. We often use those words separately and to mean two different things, but both the word vocation and calling come from the same Latin phrase, ex vocatio. They literally mean the same thing. So whether you're a plumber or a pastor, a musician or a missionary, an accountant, a carpenter, a teacher, or whatever, you were fulfilling God's call in your life because it was truly a way of bringing God into everything that you did. Everything you did was ministry. But that understanding didn't last forever, because eventually calling shifted to being more associated with religious professions. So people would receive callings from God to be pastors specifically, or priests or missionaries, whereas other occupations would just be considered vocations. They were still really important, but seeing God immersed in their work wasn't as developed at that point. It was just simply a career, whereas if you wanted to go into a ministry job, there was often some sort of a calling from God that had to be associated with this. And that division still is present today, even though I think it's a lot more convoluted. It's a lot cloudier today, because we want to figure out what we're called to do. We want to have a career, but can they be separate things? And especially if we want to go into the church, what does this even look like? And I think a lot of this confusion especially is prevalent in the church today. Maybe you, as a high schooler, went to a youth camp or some sort of a youth conference, and there was that night where a preacher came out and talked all about the call to ministry. And it was really emotional, and you're just you don't even know what to do with your life, and you raise your hand and you say, yes, I'm called to ministry, having no idea what it means. I was one of those kids, so I attest to this. But does having to receive a call to ministry mean that now your career has to be working a job in the church or in ministry? That's where we often equate these two things. But at the end of the day, like, what if we still have people asking, what if I'm not called to work in the church? Did I miss something? Or maybe they do get in the church, they study for ministry, and they come out of it and they're like, I don't know if this is where I need to be. Are they missing their calling from God at that point? The confusion continues between calling and career. But here's the main truth I want us to get today, okay? Here's the main thing I want us to remember. You can serve God's church without working in a church. You do not need a profession in the church to profess your faith. And this is especially for those of you where maybe you're on the fence between, am I supposed to pastor in the church or am I supposed to do something else? We really don't know. But at the end of the day, even the term profession as a form of work originated from jobs that were about professing their faith. But those were often jobs in the health field or lawyers. This was from a whole other different time period where it was so common to incorporate your faith into your work. You see, at the end of the day, every Christian has the same calling. It's to glorify God in everything we do, to serve His church, and to make disciples of all nations and to make Jesus known. How that calling is lived out looks different for every person, and it could even change multiple times in one person's life. But one thing that will not change is your call to minister to those around you. But maybe right now you're really trying to figure out, do you want your job, do you want your career to be devoted towards serving in the local church, towards being a missionary, towards serving in a nonprofit organization or some sort of a parachurch ministry, and that's what you want to do every single day from 8 to 5? Or do you feel called to another sort of a career? Maybe you want to start up a business, but your calling, even though you want to work at a coffee shop as your career, your calling is to provide safe spaces of community where people can feel like they can connect with others in a space outside of their home. You see that? That's still very much ministry, but maybe it's just in a different setting. So even though there is this divide and there's some of this confusion between being called to ministry and trying to figure out your career, you can find a way of how to incorporate these things together. And at the end of the day, if you are still confused, I just want to continue to encourage you to dive into this conversation with God, dig into this with prayer, ask your mentors, ask us, reach out, because if you still have questions, in fact, there's a link down in the description for you to sign up for a call coaching, is what we called it. A called coaching session where we get to have we can have a Zoom session with you, we can have a video session with you, get to know you a little bit, and give you some guidance as to what you might be feeling called towards in your ministry journey. So be sure to sign up for one of those if you are interested, and we just cannot wait to connect with you. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode, and we'll catch you in the next one.